Hi, and welcome to the first in our series on Yugoslavian history, politics, and culture. Ordinarily, this would be hosted by Vuk Cvijović. Unfortunately, Vuk was unable to join us due to personal circumstances. So he's given me some of his notes, and I will proceed as best I can in that stead. So we're going to be talking about Balkans nationalism in the 19th century. And we'll get as far as we do. He'll pick up next time the series reconvenes. We haven't set a date yet. Probably sometime in mid-September, mid to late September, will be the second episode in this series. So the rules for those of you who are unfamiliar. This is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the subjects that we will be discussing. I believe Vuk is a little bit more studied than I am, but at the same time, neither of us are doctoral students in this discipline. That said, I will endeavor to give you the best presentation I can, and I hope that you will enjoy it. I and Vuk as well will approach Yugoslavian history from a secular perspective. That is to say, we're not going to try and prioritize the Serbian perspective, the Croatian perspective, the Bosniak perspective, any of the various perspectives in the Yugoslav world. We're going to try and treat them from a historical and secular perspective. Of course, Will Wheaton's law, please be respectful. These are, of course, sensitive topics, like all historical topics that have a direct impact on today are. So let's be respectful. That said, though, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time because I believe that we should have an interactive relationship as host and participants. It shouldn't just be me rattling off information. And when I do give off that information, I'm giving it in what I call a 101 and a 201 class. And a 101 class is if you don't know anything, I'll give you enough basic information that you can put together the main pieces. But if you do know something already, I'll aspire to teach you something you didn't know. That's the 201 part of this. There's also going to be a 2-hour hard stop. So at 4 p.m. Eastern time, no matter what slide I'm on, that will be the last slide that I'll be presenting. Then I'll continue to discuss some questions or some comments as that unfurls. But there's no new information after 2 hours. You know, and I know that your time is valuable and that accordingly, we will stop at that point. When I put dates below an individual, there's the nationalism slides that are made by Vuk, so that it's not consistent for him. But in my slides, when I put dates below a certain individual, that's their years of service. That's not their birth and death date. This, like all the other series that we host here, will be recorded and you can watch it later. In fact, you can watch it later on our YouTube channel, and I would encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. The link is there. It is, and for those of you who are in Zoom, if you go to the comment section, it is in the comments as well. So you can click on that, open that in a separate browser window, and therefore you will have it in your history and you can bookmark it. Also, we really appreciate PayPal donations. This is freely given, but at the same time, it costs money to disperse and bring it to you. So any donations would be appreciated as they go towards maintaining this outlet. All right. So one of the things that we need to really talk about is what nationalism is. And while there are many types of nationalism that we're not going to discuss here, we need to sort of understand what the concept of a nation is as we enter the modern period, and how that will affect the region in the Balkans, because a lot of these concepts are directly applicable. So we're going to sort of discuss what a nation is first, then we're going to go to the concept of self-determination, then we're going to go to the concept of a nation state, and then finally we're going to talk about culturalism and cultural definition of a nation. All right, so we have this concept that prior to the modern period, we have countries and we have empires. That is to say that when you have a country or an empire, it's ruled by usually a monarchical dynasty, but it could be a dictator, it could be some representative system, but by and large, it's a ruler who has very little relationship to the ethnic groups over which he rules, right? If we look at the kings and queens of Europe through the medieval period, many of them are not from the countries that they supposedly rule over. right? If we look at, for example, the United Kingdom, the House of Windsor, which currently is the reigning monarchical family of the United Kingdom, is a German family. From their German name was Saxe-Gotha. If we go even further back, the British family was the family of Oranje-Nassau, which was a family from the Netherlands, right? So we have this sort of distinction between the people of Britain in this case, right? And the rulers who come from a completely different region of the world. They are entitled to rule by some sort of divine permission, ability to rule granted from the fact that they have wrested power perhaps from the previous government. But there's no sense that there is a connection between the people and the sovereign. The sovereign's only duty is to protect the borders and to maintain domestic tranquility, but he doesn't have a responsibility in a cultural sense, in a national sense, in a developmental sense, in a welfare sense to the people within the territory he controls. Now, this sounds very foreign to those of us who are alive today, because most of us who are alive today live in or are familiar with the concept of representative democracies. And in these democracies, the rulers at least attempt to convince the population that they are representing that they are somehow the same as them. They are perhaps of the same ethnic group. They are of the same political persuasion. They are of the same mental orientation. And this really comes out of the nationalist period, the creation of the nation. So the nation is this concept of the community, right? That sameness that I'm talking about when it comes to politicians representing their populations. So you see this idea that a nation has its own will, right? This is a unique concept, right? That the ethnic group desires things politically. That's not necessarily going to make sense, right? In the United States, for example, the Anglo-American community doesn't really have unique political desires relative to, let's say, the German-American community or relative to the Irish-American community, right? They've been sort of absorbed into white in the United States context. And so these ethnicities don't have unique desires. So it's not necessarily the case that it's going to happen. But in this period of nationalism, this creation of the nation is the grouping of ethnic groups to such a way that they have their own political aspirations. And those political aspirations can take them in very different directions all across the political spectrum, right? You can have nationalism that we see, for example, with Hitler and Mussolini, which is an expansionist nationalism, maybe irredentist nationalism, a corporatist nationalism, right? Where the nation is a growing, burgeoning nation, at least in the eye of the nationalist, and that it should acquire more territory, have more physical power over more terrain. You then have other kinds of nationalism, like, for example, Castro's nationalism in Cuba, right? This is a nationalism based on the idea of self-sovereignty and determination for people that have historically been under the occupation of a large imperial power, right? So it's more inward-looking. You then have nationalism in this sort of defensive position of we will maintain the country that we already have, right? So it's not the expansionist nationalism or irredentist nationalism of Hitler and Mussolini. It's not the inward independence-minded nationalism of Castro, but it's sort of a maintaining of the current status quo. You have unification type nationalism. Mazzini in the Italian context is really important here, the Risorgimento movement. And you have this idea of nationalism as a way that nations can come together, because if ethnic groups can express their political will through the aegis of a nation, then they can more easily and honestly broker relationships with each other. And that's where Nicola Sturgeon really fits in. So you have all these different ideas about how when you motivate an ethnic group to become a nation, to become a group of people with a specific political identity, and then that political identity will eventually have a relationship with the state. We're gonna discuss that soon, but it creates a fundamental shift in the way that politics is running, because now it is led by groups of people representing the vision of the nation rather than a top-down monarchical structure or a dictatorial structure that is determined much more by the will of the sovereign. Now, there's a quote here that Benedict Anderson wrote about nationalism. Regardless of actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each, the nation is always conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. Ultimately, it is this fraternity that makes it possible over the past 2 centuries for so many millions of people, not so much to kill as to willingly die for such limited imaginings. And I have a comment on that quote that it's a well-crafted aspirational latter-day definition by Anderson. I don't know if it's as much of a definition, but it's definitely, the first part is definitely aspirational. The second part seems a little bit deprecatory in that nationalism in many respects has become almost a religious belief by the nationalists who espouse it. It has that same sort of dogmatic character, pulling on some sort of spiritual nexus, right? The concept of the nation, the concept of the ethnicity having a political will of its own is somehow spiritual. There is no ethnic group in the sense of something beyond the human beings who constitute it in a material sense. But in a spiritual sense, it does have a will. It does have a meaning. And we can see antecedents of this nation concept in many religious structures. Probably the most famous to those in the audience here would be the concept of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, right? That's and the word Am it means nation, right? The nation of Israel. And it's this concept that the Jews, no matter where they were, had a single political, social, ethnic consciousness. And of course, rabbinic Jews would not have described it in that language. That's a very secular language. But it functionally served the same thing as the nation. And the nationalist movement that begins in the 19th century with the Romantics, uppercase R Romantics, really allows this nation concept to flourish among people other than, let's say, the Jews, for instance. We have a number of ethnicities that come into their own consciousness. Now, we sort of discussed a little bit of this, right? That the Jews had a unique ancestry and fictive kinship that's different than a lot of the peoples of Europe. A lot of the peoples of Europe had to create historical events that would serve as the nexus of their identity rather than a fictive kinship, because it was quite clear with populations so large that they couldn't all be related. And so, for example, when it comes to the French talk about their ancestry, the formation of France, as a descendant group from the Franks, even though the Franks, of course, for those who are familiar historically, were Germanic-speaking people. And they were actually the conquerors of the Latin-speaking inhabitants of Gaul. But the French identity was grafted onto this early Frankish state because it had similar borders. And the relationship between the Germanic-speaking Franks and the Latin-speaking Gaulish citizens is ultimately what gave rise to the cultural institutions of modern France. You also see this sense of common trajectory through history. And we see that with Britain and Japan, right? That these groups have, because of their island structure, have had limited migration to them throughout the latter half of the last millennium. That, of course, changes in the 20th century, but in the latter half of the last millennium, they, generally speaking, did not have much immigration to those islands. And accordingly, they maintained a very homogeneous perspective and passed through many cultural gauntlets together. That created a sense of nation. But when it came to the method by which any particular nationalist would begin to define the constructs and the edges of the nation, he looked for a number of specific characteristics. The first one is that he looked for language. If there was a similarity or consistency of language, that could be a sign of a nation. And a language is pretty easy to notice, right? It can easily be written down. It can be compared to other variants of the language. It can be compared and contrasted. Grammar can be written about it. And in cases historically with nationalism, there were cases where people who spoke different languages, and we're going to see some examples of that, claimed to be of the same nation by minimizing those linguistic differences in the grammars that they write. And cases where people who speak what is functionally the exact same language will point to specific grammatical nuances that even most fluent speakers wouldn't notice in order to functionally separate these into different languages. A good example of the former will be the creation of the Serbo-Croatian language. We're going to definitely talk about that as we move through the discussion today. And an example of the latter would be the separation of the Macedonian language from Bulgarian, or the separation from the Moldovan language from Romanian. We then have culture, and culture is sort of difficult to put a finger on. Maybe it's the local holidays that people celebrate, maybe it's the mental state that people approach things with, maybe it's the way that people interact, how they want to live their lives, but maybe it's the way they dress, maybe it's the way they talk in terms of the idioms they use. But it's sort of hard to pinpoint what culture is. In cases like the New World countries, like Canada and the United States, right? Culture is something that develops sort of as a mosaic or a melting pot of many different originating cultures held together by a civic concept of the American or Canadian nation. But in Europe, these tend to be much closer to blood and soil type of cultures. Like, who are the people who grew up in this area? What is their traditional religion? What is their traditional history? What are their traditional values? And you can see those other things that are demarcated below. And so while it may seem the case that the ethnicities that we have today and that we can identify readily today are the ethnicities, almost as if they were handed down to us, that's not the case. These are developments that are human engineered, and then more and more people agree with them, creating that kind of community. We can even see it right now if we look at Ukraine, for example, at war with Russia. Because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the concept of the Ukrainian national is becoming more and more solidified. If we wound the clock back about 20 years, most Russian speakers in the eastern part of Ukraine would have considered themselves either Russian or Soviet, and maybe they were Ukrainian, but their primary identity was that they were Russian speakers. The invasion of Russia and the uprooting of their lives by the Russian army has fundamentally changed their identity, and now they see themselves as ethnic Ukrainians as a primary identity and Russian speakers as a secondary identity. So events, timelines, speeches, these all change people's concept of ethnic identities. And so as we're going to track through this period of the last 200 years, we're going to see people constantly reevaluating, reassessing, re-understanding their nation and their sense of belonging. Another thing that we need to point out is that there's a difference between nationality, right, in terms of citizenship, and the concept of a nation as an ethnic group. And I think a really clear example here would be the Spanish crown, right? The Spanish crown was a union of a number of different separate states, right? So when Spain was united in 1492 through the marriage of Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon, that marriage created one country in terms of foreign borders, but it didn't create one country in terms of domestic political organization. It's the same way that, for example, the United States has 50 states. Those states are separate governing agencies. Imagine if that were the case, but without the federal government to hold them together, right? So you have one border for the country, but you have multiple different entities within that. And Aragon was itself composed similarly of these separate statelets. And in truth, the political system of Spain was not united until the 1830s. So for nearly 300 years of Spanish history, you have multiple governments operating within the confines of the territory of Spain. For example, the colonization of the Americas from Mexico down to Argentina was done by Castile with no assistance from Aragon. Conversely, Aragon conquered Sardinia and the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. You can see it on the map. Those were conquered by Aragon with no assistance from Castile. They were functionally operating as two separate countries, despite the fact that they had the same sovereign. And this gives rise today to the concept of Catalonian nationalism, Catalonia being a subsection of Aragon, and their rejection in a certain sense by many Catalonians, the sense that they are part of that Spanish system. They feel that their history, their nation, is going in a different direction from that of the rest of Spain, especially that of Castile, and therefore they need a government that represents the will of their nation. The next concept we really have to introduce is self-determination. So self-determination is a very tricky concept. It sort of begins to show up in full force at the beginning of the 20th century, and Woodrow Wilson is probably its best exponent. We've talked about how nations have political will and political associations, and that nations, right, these ethnic groups with the political aspirations know what's in their own interest. They can best achieve what's in their own interest. And so accordingly, those nations should become the governing apparatus of the political state in which they sit. In practice, that means, in a lot of cases, independence, right? You have a multinational empire, let's say the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It has German speakers, Hungarian speakers, South Slavic speakers, East Slavic speakers, Czechs, Slovaks. You have Romanians. You have so many different types. You have Italians as well. So many different types of speakers and peoples that it doesn't make sense for the Germans, the German speakers, the Austrians, to rule the whole thing, because it ignores the political will of those other peoples, those other nations within the empire. And so it would seem uncontroversial, right, that these nations would be the best poised to determine their own future. But there are several questions that we should ask about this to see whether or not it's actually viable, right? What happens if we have different nations in the same territory, right? It's very rare that you have a situation where one nation is 100% of the residents of a given jurisdiction. It's just people are messier than that. People move from place to place. People change the languages that they speak. They change the nationalities with which they associate based on the currents, right? We just talked about the Ukraine situation. So what happens when you have multiple nations in the same physical land territory? Can they both self-determine on that territory? Well, probably not. You can't really have two governments operating in the same territory with different interests. And how do we define, the extent of a nation? Is it, you have many cases in which nations will layer on top of each other, right? Are German speakers from Austria the same nation as German speakers from Berlin? It may seem to be an obvious question one way or the other. Well, they speak German, but German speakers in Berlin are a different religion. They're Lutheran versus those in Austria who are Catholic. Maybe it's the case that we talk about the history. German speakers in Berlin have been at war with German speakers in Vienna for centuries. And then in other centuries, they've been allies. Two functioning separate polities. Maybe, so it's not entirely clear whether they are part of the same German-speaking people nation, or the German-speaking people nation could be subdivided into Prussians and Bavarians and Baden-Württembergers and Nordrhein-Westfaleners and Austrians and all these different groups, and Plattdeutsch speakers and all of this. And of course, where do German-speaking Jews fit into this sort of creation of German nations? So the extent to which a nation expands or contracts, this is certainly a question that nationalists have to grapple with. Then we have the strange question of, what if you have a nationality that doesn't actually believe that the best course of action for itself is to have political power? And there are several reasons for this. There could be, for example, if we look at the Jews of Europe, with the exception of the city of Thessaloniki, and even then, for a very limited period of time, there's really nowhere in Europe where Jews are a majority. So how are Jews going to manifest self-determination in the European context? The same could be said of groups like the Romani, or better known as Gypsies, right? They're not a majority in any place. How are they going to manifest nationalism in that sense? You can also have the case of, what if you are a minority that is a majority in certain regions, but you actually prefer the government of the other group of people because it maintains the peace better than you feel like your nation would. A perfect example here was throughout most of the history of the Ottoman Empire, it controlled significant sections of the Arab world. Nationalism came to the Arab world in the 19th century, but we really didn't see Arab nationalism as a movement until the early 20th century, because by and large, Arabs liked the way the Ottomans were ruling them. Of course, that changes in the early 20th century with the CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress, and then following that, the Western mandate system. But generally speaking, they liked the system where they weren't in charge. They liked what it did for them. So should we compel them to accept their own nation states, or should we accept they want to live under an imperial structure? Then are there nations where we would not want them to self-determine? Maybe it's more injurious if they self-determine. A perfect example might be that a nation might be too physically small to defend itself if it self-determined. And so that outcome might be worse for them. And so we may want to put them with another nation. And then, of course, nationalism and the cultural fervor that it creates might lead to a sense of superior cultural identity. And so perhaps we don't want self-determination in the case where it would lead to that kind of superiority complex, or if there are some nations that we think deserve self-determination and others that we think don't. The clearest time that Woodrow Wilson's vision of nationalism came about was in his Declaration of the 14 Points. And for those of you who followed me in my Middle Eastern history series, the 14 points was heard around the world. This is not just something that affected Germany, Austria, France, and Britain, right? These the main parties of World War I. Persians took notice of the 14 points. Serbians took notice of the 14 points. Armenians took notice of the 14 points. Turks took notice of the 14 points. In fact, all the groups that I've mentioned have uttered that their devotion to self-determination and nationalism for their own peoples is based on the concept enumerated by Woodrow Wilson in the 14 points. And in particular, it's point 5 that's really important, that a free, open-minded, and absolute adjustment of all colonial claims based on a strict observance of the principle that in determining such questions of sovereignty, the interests of the populations concerned must have equal weight with the equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined. And in non-legalese, that means that we have to care about what the people in the region want for their government as much, if not more, than the people who currently sit in the capital city of that large empire and their views about the region. People should be able to choose by plebiscite, by voting, by some other metric that shows their will, to determine their own future as a political entity once they have determined that they are already a nation. We then, and this is something that we're going to address much later in the series, but if you look, and I don't like these maps in particular because they're very simplistic. A lot of these territories are a lot squishier and messier than these pictures would show. But you can see that within the Yugoslav context, you have many nations that sit within the borders of that territory. And so dividing the territory between those different nations is not necessarily as easy as we would be inclined to believe. And now we get to the point of the nation state. So this is when the nation is able to take control of a governing entity, right? So the nation, right, is this ethnic community with this political will, and now it's taken over a state, a sovereign piece of land. And so the combination of a nation ruling over such a state is a nation state. So, for example, right, France is the territory of the French, Denmark is the territory of the Danes, Germany is the territory of the Germans, but contrast that with the United States is not the territory of the ethnic United Statesians, right? The United States is a country of many different ethnicities, and so it's not a nation state. And nation states have come into existence through the amalgamation of multiple different state entities. Like, for example, Germany and Italy came out of unification efforts, but much more often it comes through division, right? The Austro-Hungarian Empire exploded into about 7 different nations. The former Republic of Yugoslavia that existed in 1985 is now 7 different nation states. So the nation state is this concept that the nation is now in control of a political entity. And so we can see, if we look at Europe in 1815, we have a number of large empires. And if we look at Europe in the present day, most of those empires, especially when we get to the east of the eastern part of Europe, those empires have collapsed into numerous smaller nations. And those nations, with certain small exceptions, are all nation states, right? Poland is the state of the Poles. Czech Republic and Slovakia are the nation states of the Czech people and the Slovaks, respectively. Serbia is the nation state of the Serbs, and on and on and on. You have this contrast between nation states and colonialism, right? And there was the sense, especially during the imperial period, that certain nations had the right to rule over other nations. It's called chauvinistic nationalism, that your culture is better than the culture of the nations that you conquer, and so you can create an empire above them. There's a comment here: Woodrow Wilson's 14 points declaring self-determination is admirable. However, he was a racist and resegregated the federal government. Is it hypocrisy? Yeah, absolutely. I think that Woodrow Wilson had an incredible respect for the Europeans, various ethnicities, and I think he was deeply disrespectful of those who were not European, be they Jewish, Black, or otherwise. And so I think that sort of brings up a really important point that we need to keep in mind, is that somebody can be very forward-thinking in one area of their political discourse and also very regressive in other areas of their political discourse. It's the idea that a person will be uniformly progressive or uniformly regressive or traditional is incorrect. In many cases, political figures had a wide variety of views and don't fit into the narrow binary categorizations that we like to use today. And even today, those categorizations are ineloquent and incorrect in many cases. But if we go back to the chauvinistic nationalism, we have this idea that certain peoples are not ready for self-determination. Certain peoples need to develop their culture more. For example, we have the view that is predominant during the colonial period, and that view was that eventually, and it was advocated by John Stuart Mill, this view that there is a telos, or an end goal of civilization, and certain peoples are further along the road to that goal than other people are. Certain nations have achieved more along that progressive path, and accordingly, those who are further behind should be brought forward. Right? John Stuart Mill advocated this sort of view, and that gave rise to the idea of the white man's burden expressed by Rudyard Kipling, right? This idea that the white man, referring to Britain and British civilization, was more advanced than the rest of the world, and that it had a duty to impose that better civilization on the barbarians of the rest of the world in order to bring them into the place where they would be effective at self-determining. Winston Churchill, of course, held the same view. And we have a comment here that expresses much the same, in that too often those inclined to conflate nationhood with spiritual actualization tend to promote willingness to kill for their beliefs, but glorify that killing as dying for the improvement of society. And it's very sad. And Wilson was a prime example of having the white man's burden. So The contrasting view of chauvinistic nationalism would be liberal internationalism, right? This idea that after 1648, when you have Westphalian states, those states should see each other as equals, and those states should negotiate with each other as equals. Now, once you have a sovereign nation, it can reach out to talk to other nations, and therefore create a harmonious international community that can resolve disputes more effectively, because the sovereigns represent the will of the peoples behind them. And finally, we have culturalism. One of the most important things that we're going to see over the course of our discussion in Yugoslavia is the concept of the Volksgeist, or the spirit of the nation, of the people's spirit. And the Volksgeist is sort of hard to put into a clear definition because it is a cultural term. But as best as I can say, Volk means people, Geist means spirit. And so this is the way in which the culture of the people makes manifest. What are the traditions of the people? What do they say? What stories do they tell their kids? What languages do they speak? Where do they go every year on pilgrimage? What kinds of foods do they prepare? These sort of very farm-oriented, cultural, historical traditions of the people, the way that they thought and conducted their lives, that was what was called a Volksgeist. And this was seen by many nationalists to be the key element in determining the uniqueness of their cultural milieu. You can compare that, for example, with urbanism, right? If you live in or near a major urban city, I'm going to use New York as an example. New York has a mix of flavors and cultures, but it doesn't have anything in most senses that is truly American, right? And you have this sort of contrast that's often drawn up between Main Street and Wall Street, right, in American politics, where Main Street refers to this common Volksgeist, this sense of, what does the average American who's living a normal day-to-day life feel, and Wall Street representing the business interests and the sort of high-paced, internationalized life that exists in major urban cities. And in many cases, that sort of urbanized life is consistent across many different countries. In fact, I think most people would say that a New Yorker would find it easier to live in London, Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, Beijing, any other large major internationalized city than they would living just 3 or 4 hours away in upstate New York or in Rust Belt country in Pennsylvania, where the style of life is extremely different. The way that people live, behave, talk, how they socialize are all very radically different than they are in the cities. And somehow that way, that sort of rural way, is the real, in this case, America, but you could use that for any part of the world. So another thing that we should discuss before we close out our discussion on nationalism, because it's relevant to many of our nationalist experiences in the West, is the concept of civic nationalism. And this is very prominent in the countries of the Western Hemisphere: United States, Canada, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico. Civic nationalism is the idea that it doesn't matter what ethnicity you are from, or it shouldn't matter. Unfortunately, for most countries in the Western Hemisphere, there is a glaringly obvious problem of historical racism and injustice. But it shouldn't matter what ethnicity you're from. Your Americanness, your Canadianness, your Argentinianness, your Brazilianness, your Mexicanness is contingent on you believing in the political aspirations of the wider polity. Right? As an American, do you believe in the Bill of Rights? Do you believe in the value of the Constitution, of voting, of the democratic process, of the concepts of liberty and justice? These sort of ephemeral qualities are considered the harbinger of American identity. And if you play the game with those sets of political ideological beliefs, you are considered part of the nation. Your civic action, right, your engagement with the politics of the state, is what determines your nationalism, not your ethnic background, not your religious background or cultural background. There's a question of what role did the impact of organized religion have on nationalism? Organized religion was essential in nationalism. And we see it in many cases much more prominent in Eastern Europe than we do, for example, in Western Europe. But if you, and I discussed this in significantly more depth in my episode 28 of my Middle Eastern and North African history series, but the Greek Orthodox Church became the clarion in many cases for Greek nationalism, that the Bulgarian Exarchate, which was the Bulgarian church, became the clarion call for Bulgarian nationalism, that nationalists who were secular in their orientation often had issues in creating a national identity separate from religion. One perfect example here is Adamantios Korais, right? He was a Greek secular-oriented nationalist. He lived most of his life in Netherlands, but he was Greek, and he was behind the Culturalism movement, the movement to create a modern highbrow level Greek. Again, that's another topic that we could touch on, and I do much more in that episode. But he was secular, and even he said that without the Greek Orthodox Church, he couldn't understand what Greek culture was. And at the same time, you had bishops of the Greek Orthodox Church going out and knighting, or sacralizing is probably a better phrase, sacralizing the holy soldiers of the Greek nationalist movement, who themselves were religious people, but lay religious people, right? And so you have this pull from the religious organizations that are espousing nationalist doctrines in this sort of symbiotic relationship where the nationalists vindicate the historic traditions of the religious and the religious vindicate the political aspirations of the nationalists. Now, you have the opposite phenomenon going on in Germany, because German unification between the German North, which was primarily Lutheran and Calvinist, and the German South, which was primarily Catholic, you have the leaders of the religious movements often talking against the political unification of Germany. And they do so because the Protestants less so than the Catholics. And the Catholics the Catholic leadership is arguing against the unification of Germany in the fear that the Catholic majority regions would be subjected to forcible Protestantization or some other form of religious coercion. And so you sort of have a pull against the nationalist doctrines. And it was only when Otto von Bismarck made clear that he would respect the Catholicism of the South, and the Catholic South had to decide between allying with France against the North Germans or allying with the North Germans against the French in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, that the Catholic leadership finally gave assent to unification with the North German Confederation. So organized religion, absolutely critical in understanding the growth of nationalism in Europe, even though in many cases nationalism was led primarily by secular individuals. If we go to the Middle East, in many cases, religious individuals had different ideas about how a nation state should be organized than secular individuals did. And secular individuals tended to choose ethnic groups, and religious people tended to create Muslim as an ethnic group. They tended to see Muslim as an ethnic group and then promoted nationalism based on the Muslim identity rather than, let's say, the Turkish or the Persian or the Kurdish or any ethnic label. And so organized religion, absolutely important in creating that distinction and the feuding that began to occur in the 1920s and onward between the ethnic nationalists and the Muslim nationalists. So great question. All right, so if we go to the Ottoman Empire, right, we have to remember that Yugoslavia, as we understand it today, was divided. Do I have a map? There's a question, didn't Jews do the same? Jews have a very strange relationship with nationalism because the Jewish political situation at the end of the 19th century was that they were not a majority in any place in the world except perhaps some isolated cities. Now, so the question became, how do we have a situation where we can create a Jewish Volksgeist and we can create a Jewish nation that a Jewish state can then be built upon, right? A Jewish nation state. And so you had to have a mass migration of Jews to somewhere in order to create a Jewish nation state. Now, there's a lot of hand-wringing about how that was chosen and where that ended up, but suffice to say, the end decision of Jewish nationalists was to build that in what is today the modern state of Israel. But the thing is that Jewish religious clergy were thoroughly against the prospect of nationalism. The Orthodox Jewish world didn't become majority supportive of Israel until the 1960s. And there were some Orthodox Jews who supported the creation of a Jewish state, but these were small minorities, and that really only started in the 1930s with Rabbi Abraham Kook. Prior to this, almost all major Jewish religious authorities condemned Zionism, and they condemned it not because they saw some fundamental issue with Judaism or some other issue there, but they condemned it because they felt that this was a secular movement, one, and number two, they condemned it because they saw it as a violation of God's will, that God did not allow the Jews to come together as a nation state. So Zionism remains a thoroughly secular movement from its foundation in the early 1890s into the 1930s, and wouldn't take on religious Zionism, which is a modern phenomenon in Israel, Date Leumi, for those who are familiar with the Hebrew, is a phenomenon of the 1970s and later. So it's as Israel has become more instantiated as a historical presence, more religious Jews have glommed onto it. But it's the tail wagging the dog, not the other way around. There's a question here. Appealing to mobilizing with various populist interpretations of Christian sects has had a profound influence in the United States populist nationalism in the 19th century and since the late 20th century, has it not? Absolutely. I would say that a lot of the right wing in American politics has come from Christian populism. And we see it in the Great Awakening. We see it again in the development of the evangelical movement. A lot of these religious movements have profound political consequences. The one thing I would say is that the dominionist perspective, which is the perspective that America should be a Christian country from a legal perspective, right? That it should be a Christian nation state representing the Christian Americans, generally is less supported by even evangelicals than the specific policy prescriptions that they would rather have. And so the dominionist movement as such generally doesn't coalesce in the same national spirit with the same kinds of goals of nation change that we see in Europe. That's not to say that they aren't potent. I think that without the consistent efforts of the evangelical movement, the decision in the recent decisions on abortion and other limiting aspects of the US Supreme Court today could not have happened. All right, so back to Yugoslavia. All right, so the territory of Yugoslavia really exists here, and I'm drawing it sort of in this red color, and it's not entirely accurate. Some of this is including the territory of other countries, but one thing I want to draw and make particularly clear: at the beginning of the 19th century, the territory of Yugoslavia, the area of the South Slavs, excluding Bulgaria, was divided between the Austrian Empire in the north, which would become the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1867, and the Ottoman Empire to the south. Now you can see that Serbia and Bosnia are identified on that map And the reason for that is that in 1815, those areas already had some kind of nominal independence, even though they were vassal states of the larger territory. But because the Southern Slavs were divided between two large empires, a lot of the discussion in the 19th century is going to be understanding the positions of those groups within those two empires and their attempt to breach the divide that had kept them apart. So within the Ottoman Empire, we have this thing called the millet. And the millet is this system where the minority religions, meaning those who are not Muslim, right? The minority religions would have their own form of governance. And the three dominant millets were the Greeks, the Armenians, and the Jews. But there were a number of minor millets as well. And so the Serbian Orthodox Church had its own millet. The Catholics of some of the areas of Bosnia would be represented by their own Franciscan patriarchs. In fact, if we remember from our discussions in the Middle East, Middle Eastern history series, ever since the time of Mehmet II the Conqueror, there was explicit permission given by the Franciscans to continue in Sarajevo, which is in Bosnia, and those religious people were able to keep their traditions. But we should be clear that this was not a system of equality. This was a system of tolerated difference. And so the Muslims and those in the millets is just the Turkish word for nation. And so so you can already see the concept of nation exists within a Turkish context. And the leaders of those nations do have some political will, but you have Muslim lives living in one way and millet lives living rather separately within the same city. It's the same way that, for example, within a cosmopolitan city like New York, unless you really try, you will sort of live your life within the community that you sit in, and you really won't engage with other communities. You have to push out beyond your boundaries in order to do that. And many of the large-scale celebrations that Christians tend to perform were banned, as was the carrying of firearms by most Christian subjects. And oftentimes large ornate churches had been converted into mosques, which meant that for many of the South Slavs, especially those of Catholic or Orthodox heritage, there was a sense of enmity towards the Muslim governing officials because a lot of their form of Christianity couldn't be represented. That said, the irony, of course, is, and Muslims in the region are often quick to point this out, had the Ottoman Empire had not taken over Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and all these other regions, and they had instead fallen to Catholic Western Europe, the Orthodox Church would likely have been destroyed because the Catholics were less tolerant of religious differentiation under the under the Christian aegis. And if we look at the Balkans, we can see that the Balkans was a very religiously diverse place. It still is, an ethnically diverse place. It still is. Although the borders today make a lot more sense than they did during the period of the Ottoman Empire, when all these territories were sort of ethnically mixed to a much greater degree. One of the things that nationalism ends up doing is it ends up resulting in numerous population transfers, whether officially legislated transfers, right? There's a treaty and a number of people move on account of the treaty, or because there's violence going on and the people would rather not be in an area controlled by soldiers that they don't quite see eye to eye with. But because of this religious diversity, a lot of the questions that we were asking about nationalism, about dividing this territory, really come to the fore. Now, one of the things that we have to understand is that the Serbian memory of the Ottoman occupation is long and comes out of a number of specific occurrences within the Serbian memory. If we go all the way back to 1389, of course, there is the Battle of Kosovo. The Battle of Kosovo, by the way, we have a whole presentation on that on our website. But the result of the Battle of Kosovo was effectively that Serbia was lost its independence and became part of the Ottoman Empire. And following that, at any opportunity to try and rebel and resecure independence, the Serbians took it. So during the Long Turkish War, which was a war between Hungarians and the Ottoman Empire, the Serbians rebelled. And accordingly, Koca Sinan Pasha, who was the Turkish governor of the region, exhumed the relic of Saint Sava. Saint Sava was a historic Serbian leader, and burned these relics, right? It was cultural desecration and also religious desecration. And memories like this are etched far more prominently in the Serbian memory than are the general tolerance and acceptance that occurred over the longevity of Turkish rule. We also have resulting migrations. As the Ottoman Empire pushed further north, and on the map on the right-hand side, I have the modern borders transposed over the territory from that time period. The Ottoman Empire existing in what is today the southern half of Romania, most of what is today Serbia, and the Bosnian, and bordering at the Bosnian-Croatian border. A number of Serbs fled the Ottoman advance on Belgrade. The Ottomans did conquer Belgrade and made it a northern fortress of theirs. And so you begin to see Serbian migrations into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the beginning of a relationship developing between Serbians and other members of the local nations, right? This creates a number of Serbian population regions within what is today Hungary, right? And this confuses the concept of nationalism, as we're going to see, because you have these Serbian populations in areas where Serbs are not a majority, but they feel like they should deserve a nation. They were expelled from their homeland, either by force or out of fear of what the Ottomans would do. And many of them, like Patriarch Arsenia III Czarnojević, supported militant action against the Ottoman Empire. So they were also militarily aligned with the Habsburgs in Hungary, and so they felt that they were somehow entitled to a certain degree to territory or compensation. We have additional wars over the Serbian territory. In the early 1700s, the Austrians had won a small battle against the Ottoman Empire, and the Kingdom of Serbia, based at Belgrade, was given some sort of limited autonomy. But after the Austro-Russo-Turkish War of 1735 to 1739, the Serbs lost that power and were integrated back into the Ottoman Empire, which of course resulted in a destruction of their state and a limiting of privileges for them. And so you see the Serbians who remain in the Ottoman territories have to consistently deal with the increasing of privileges and then the later taking away of those privileges when Serbians begin to press for more autonomy or more independence, often by aligning themselves with the enemies of the Ottoman Empire. In fact, a number of Serbian militias begin forming within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, within the Austrian Empire. And one of these in particular were the Serbian militias led by Vuk Isakovic. These served alongside the Austrian forces in attempting to liberate the Kingdom of Serbia back from Ottoman influence. Remember, after 1739, it had been reintegrated into the Ottoman Empire, but the Austrians were not able to achieve this. The Russians, however, had much more success in beating back the Ottoman Empire. And so increasingly, Serbians began to turn their attention towards Russia as a possible avenue, a possible vector for achieving their liberation. The last attempt that Serbs would take under the Austrian aegis would be during the Russo-Turkish War of 1787 to 1792. The Austrians participated, and the Austrians had already established a group of Serbians called the Freikorps, or the Free Army, led by Kocha and Jelkovic. And those forces were able to retake Belgrade, retake a number of historic Serbian-controlled territories, but the Ottomans were able to take those back towards the end of the war, and that final defeat of independent Serbia, supported by the Habsburgs, by the Austrians, led to a full abandonment by the Serbs of any Austro-Hungarian-based solution. But even though the Ottoman Empire had retaken the territory of Serbia, it became very clear to many of the Ottoman leaders that there would have to be some kind of agreement struck with the Serbs for autonomy if they didn't want Serbia to become a restless region. And so Selim III, who was Sultan Caliph of the Ottoman Empire from 1709 to 1807, he reached out to a number of what were called the Oberknez, or the high princes of Serbia. This is Aleksa Nenadlovic, who is one of these Oberknez. And they gave them limited self-government within Serbia, a high degree of autonomy relative to what had existed originally within the Ottoman Empire. Now, separate from this, Selim III was engaging in numerous reforms throughout the Ottoman Empire. We discussed those in the Middle Eastern History series. Suffice it to say that many of the janissaries that were located in the northern regions of the Balkans were going to lose a significant amount of power. Many of these, called Dahiye, began to unite behind one particular leader named Osman Pazvantolu, who was based in Western Bulgaria. Osman Pazvantolu organized a number of Dahiya who assassinated Haji Mustafa Pasha in 1801. Haji Mustafa Pasha was appointed to oversee the Oberknez by the Ottoman Empire, right? So you have this sort of relationship between the Serbian high princes and the Ottoman power structure, where the Ottomans have a governor of the region, but the Oberknez run day-to-day life in the smaller regions within that larger government. But the Janissaries, by killing Haji Mustafa, began to take power directly for their own. So you have this weird situation now developing where, in order to restore Serbian autonomy within the Ottoman Empire, the Serbians actually end up extending their services to Selim III, fighting alongside the Ottoman national government to liberate Serbia from the Janissaries, who had broken off from the Ottoman government. This is actually where the creation of Karađorđe comes from. Kara is the Turkish word for black, but Karađorđe, his given name was George, right? Karađorđe became one of the leaders within the Serbian regiments that were set to take down Osman Pazvantolu. One of the interesting things, and you may have noticed it in the clothes of the Oberknez and in the clothes of Karađorđe, is that these are Serbians holding weapons. One of the things that we mentioned when we talked about the millet is that non-Muslim citizens of the Ottoman Empire were not allowed to keep and bear arms. But because of the devolution of authority to the autonomous Serbians under Selim III, Serbians were allowed to carry pistols and other weapons in order to defend themselves and to govern the territory, which was, of course, a huge cultural shift within the Ottoman Empire. And this presaged a number of other gains and changes that would develop in the Serbian population. So, as I said, Karađorđe was tasked by the Ottoman authorities in order to overthrow the government of the Janissaries and therefore restore the situation of the Ottoman Empire. So the assassination happened in 1801. In 1804, he began what is known as the First Serbian Uprising. And he gathered a number of important Serbians together at Orasac in 1804. At Orasac. Oh, wow, I can't pronounce Serbian today. Orasac in 1804. And at this gathering, these Serbian leaders were now armed because the Ottoman Empire permitted them to have military weapons in order to take on the Dahia, these renegade Janissaries. They swear at the Orasac assembly that they will restore an independent and free Serbia in violation of their permission under the Ottoman Empire. They were stretching for more independence. And in 1806, Karađorđe led the conquest of Belgrade. The Dahia were removed. And then Karađorđe continued his fight against the Ottoman Empire to secure more and more territory for Serbia. One of the sad moments of this war, and one that is remembered in solemnity within Serbia, is some of the Ottoman attacks against him near the city of Niš. And there, all the Serbians that were killed, their skulls were taken and built into a tower. That tower still survives. That is a real picture of the tower. Of course, there are many holes from where skulls have fallen out, but this was made by the Ottoman forces in order to intimidate Serbians against seeking independence. Of course, the irony is that it now sits in Serbia today. One of the advantages that the Serbians had towards the end of the uprising was that the Ottoman Empire took the French side in the Napoleonic Wars that were ongoing. The Napoleonic Wars started right in 1804, but the Ottoman Empire only really took the French side in earnest in 1807. When Russia declared war against the Ottoman Empire declared war against France in 1812, it also effectively declared war against the Ottoman Empire, and Mikhail Kutuzov led a successful invasion into what is now Romania and Bulgaria, extracting numerous concessions from the Ottomans, including recognition of Karađorđe's state. We then have the Second Serbian Uprising. So in order to get to that, we have to sort of understand a little bit about how the movements for a Christian Balkans were being organized. There what was called the Felicieteria, or the honorary. It was a Greek nationalist society, but they inducted into their membership a number of other Christians from Southeastern Europe, particularly Bulgarians and Serbians. They were based in Odessa, which was, of course, it's part of modern Ukraine today, but that was a city that was part of the Russian Empire then. And what ends up happening is that these societies together support the creation of a new Serbia, a Serbia that would be led not by Karađorđe, but by a much milder hand, Miloš Obrenović. And in fact, we can, throughout the history of Serbia, the Karađorđe and his descendants, the Karađorđevićes, and Miloš Obrenović's descendants, the Obrenovićes, will be seen as sort of two political sides of the Serbian coin. The Karađorđevićes tend to be more aggressive, more Russian-oriented, and the Obrenovićes tend to be more diplomatic and more Austrian-oriented. Following the Takovo conference, Miloš Obrenović challenges Karađorđe and even has Karađorđe assassinated in 1817 as he was waiting by the wayside, trying to sneak back into Serbia. He had fled the country after the Serbian uprising was put down. And he was trying to sneak back into the country, but one of Obrenovic's agents killed him, and Miloš Obrenović was able to inherit power over Serbia. One of the interesting things is that in 1835, there what was called the Candlemas Constitution, or the first constitution of Serbia, or the Constitution of 1835. And this constitution did a number of things, but most prominently, it created a number of rights and democratic institutions within Serbia. And it was one of the most liberal constitutions that had ever been written in Europe. But I want to take a step back and point out that it was a constitution. We're familiar, of course, with the American Constitution of 1789, but in the old world, constitutions were exceedingly rare. And for many people, the idea, especially those on the more conservative side of politics, constitutions were an unnecessary restriction on the power of the sovereign, right? A constitution sets out the relationship between the sovereign and the citizens, and what the sovereign can do on behalf of the citizens, and what the sovereign cannot do on behalf of the citizens. And also it explains where the power of the sovereign derives. Does it derive from the citizens? Does it derive from a god? Does it derive from some other entity? And so the Serbian constitution, by literally existing, meant that the sovereign was not all powerful, that some of his power was contingent. And because of this, the Serbians and the Ottomans agreed that the Serbian state could not survive with this constitution. So those regions became increasingly reabsorbed by the larger Ottoman Empire and by Austria. So we then get to this period in the mid-1800s as we're beginning to try and determine what the future of Serbia is. And a number of Serbianists, if we can call them that, began to try and create a Serbian national identity, right? It's not to say that people didn't identify as Serbian Orthodox by religion, or that they didn't agree with these national symbols, the historic defeat at Kosovo, the relics of Saint Sava, the first Serbian uprising of Karađorđe, the Oršac Assembly, all of these kinds of things. They were completely on board with these things, but they didn't feel like a unified will. They didn't feel some sort of impetus to sort of stand together. And this meant that Serbian leadership had to step in and do the grunt work here. So you end up having cultural leaders develop who would take that on. One of these was Dositej Obradović. Dositej Obradović focused himself on formulating Serbian literature. What would a Serbian literature look like? What kind of themes would it support? How could it relate to the national consciousness? He also tried to streamline the Serbian language, because in many cases, Serbian was a number of distinct dialects. We're going to see how that maps out. And so trying to create a coherent form of Serbian for use in literature that would be understood by the entire population and not make anybody feel like they were being isolated or kept out because their language wasn't represented. On the other side of the coin, you have Vuk Cvijović. And Vuk Cvijović is probably the most important person in the development of the Serbian national consciousness. His primary act was to go into the local communities, into the main street of Serbia, and listen to people's stories and write them down. He wrote numerous anthologies of what Serbian local life was like. What did Serbians eat? What did Serbians say? How did Serbians understand life? And he began to expand this into a discussion of what being Serbian was. And what he wrote was very widely consumed, the same with Obradović. And these two people were responsible for energizing significant portions of the Serbian population into holding nationalist aspirations for the whole of Serbia. Of course, these individuals are national heroes. You can see for Obradovic, this is a picture, I think, from the it's from a Serbian stamp during the Yugoslav period, or maybe a little bit afterwards. And Vuk Cvijović has a number of museums throughout the country. This is just one dedicated to both of them in Belgrade. On the Croatian side, within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you also have the development of a national identity in what's called the Illyrian Movement or the Croatian Revival. The choice of the term Illyria is because that region, what we would today call former Yugoslavia, was in Roman times called Illyria, and was sort of a sense to try and create an indigeneity for the Slavs living in that region. In particular, one of the greatest advocates of Illyrianism was, ironically, himself not Croatian. Ljudevit Guy was his Croatian name, but he was born Ludwig Guy. He was German, or rather German-speaking is better to say. His ancestors were French Huguenots, which shows you in many respects how identity is so fluid. His ancestors came from France. They were French-speaking. When they moved to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they began to move into a German-speaking community. And so by the time Ludwig was born, he was a native German speaker, but he fell in love with Croatian identity. And so he began to develop the modern Croatian alphabet. You can see he began to publish a newspaper called the Hrvatska Slavonika I Dalmatinska, referring to the various regions of what is today Croatia. Right? Hrvatska is the Croatian word for Croatian. Slavonika is the northern part of Croatia, around sort of like the Bend. And Dalmatia is the southernmost portion of modern Croatia. And of course, on the weekend, like the New York Times, the Danica, they had a magazine that was published, and that magazine was called the Danica. And so Ljudevit Guy was responsible for standardizing this alphabet in Latin characters. And he made a number of conscious choices when he standardized Croatian. Some of those choices were that he would avoid unique characters, right? All of his characters were normal Latin letters. They might have a diacritic here or there, but he didn't invent new letters. You can contrast this, for example, with Icelandic, which has letters that don't exist in the typical Latin alphabet. He also standardized spellings. So each letter can only have one sound, and letters are typically not used in combination with other letters unless that combination makes sense from the mixture of those letters. Like, for example, in English, we have TH, but you don't know how to pronounce TH if you know how to pronounce the letter T and you know how to pronounce the letter H, right? It's not th. It's a completely different sound. It's th. When Ljudevit Guy put together the Croatian alphabet, he did exactly the same thing, removing any letters where you couldn't know simply by putting the letter one after the next, how to pronounce something, which was key in spreading literacy among Croat people. Croats, because of the orientation of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, either spoke German or spoke Hungarian, as well as their Croatian language. And so the Croatian language was seen as a lesser language, and the German or Hungarian was seen as the higher language. He reversed this with the creation of a Croatian identity focused on the Croatian language, and that really began to orient the Croatians towards their own national identity as opposed to a larger Austro-Hungarian imperial identity. But I just want to point out that not all nationalist movements, not all revolt movements were oriented towards the independence. We're not all motivated towards the nationalism of, a Serbian identity or a Croatian identity. In Bosnia, we have the exact opposite taking place. In 1831, there are more reforms being implemented in Constantinople by the Ottoman Empire. And so the Muslim leaders of what was known as Bosnia Eyalet, Eyalet means state, right? So the state of Bosnia in the Ottoman Empire, which roughly corresponds to some of the area in red, which is an earlier iteration of the Bosnia Eyalet, and the green territory, which is the modern territory of Bosnia. So sort of like mix them together and you'll have an idea of where Bosnia Eyalet is. Those were ruled by historic janissaries, and the janissaries were beginning to lose more and more power in Constantinople. So some of those janissaries, wanting to keep their historic rights and privileges, revolted. And so these revolts centered around Husein Gradaščević, who was ethnic Slav. He was a speaker of the same language that Ljudevit Gaj had just standardized in Croatia, and that Obradović had written his essays in. But instead of trying to promote a Muslim Slavic identity, he in fact was trying to retain Ottoman control of the region in the historic way that it had manifested. Now, the Ottoman Empire swiftly put an end to him. They besieged his fortress at Gradačac, which you can see there, and they undid him. But this should sort of prime you for the idea that it's not necessarily the case that all these different Slavic groups had the same national aspirations. The Croatians may have been moving towards an independence, and so had the Serbians, but the Bosnians were resisting the possibility of self-determination and instead requesting to remain within the Ottoman Empire, within a more traditional version of the Ottoman Empire, as the Ottoman Empire was modernizing. So, as I've been talking, we should be clear about what's liberal and what's conservative during this period. Right? We talked about the first issue, of course, of constitutionalism, that the liberals believe that there should be a constitution that creates a relationship between the state the sovereign and the citizens. And conservatives believe that that would unduly empower citizens and lead to chaos. The sovereign should be able to exercise authority and put down any unnecessary activities. The liberals supported more modern developments, things like secularism, things like constitutionalism, things like empowering bourgeoisie who weren't born with privilege, but who gained it through their economic and social development. By contrast, the conservatives liked the divine right of kings, the old aristocracy, and supporting established churches. Liberals also see the government as having a duty to protect people's personal rights, things like freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of religion. Conservatives disagreed. They argue that the government should crush protests, limit freedoms, and in this way, you would have greater peace and greater stability. Remember, the empires had existed for a long time. It was a very stable power structure. It just is not a very free one. And so the liberals argued that you should sacrifice some stability for freedom. And the conservatives disagreed. And in 1848, we had massive revolutions throughout Europe, led by liberals throughout the main parts of Europe. But if you notice, none of them happens in Yugoslavia. This is because the movements that were going on there were already in a sort of swing, and there was not enough power for them to rise up on their own. Another important point is that with regards to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was a Hungarian revolt in 1848, and that put Lajos Kossuth in power of Hungary. Now, as you can see from the map in the center, the Kingdom of Hungary was not just made of Hungarians, those are in the green, but it was made up of a number of different ethnicities. Croatians are represented in dark blue, and Serbs are represented in red. there are a number of other ethnicities as well, but Lajos Kossuth, while desiring empowered status for the Hungarians who had been disempowered under the Austrian system, was very much in favor, and so were those of his cohort, for what was called Magyarization or Hungarification of the other groups within the empire. So while they wanted their cultural zeitgeist respected, they were not respectful towards the views of others. And so you had a counter-revolution led by the Germans, German-speaking Austrians, but that German-speaking Austrian counter-revolution was supported by a number of the non-Hungarian entities within the larger Kingdom of Hungary. So Ban Josip Jelačić, who you can see in the lower left-hand side, led the Croats against the Hungarians, and Lajos Kossuth was actually forced into exile. He famously came to America and gave a number of speeches on freedom and independence. He was very warmly welcomed here in the United States. But this ended the experiment in Hungarian independence or quasi-independence until a second revolution in 1867. It also resulted in the creation of Serbian Vojvodina, which was an area where, if you look at the map of larger Hungary, a lot of those red areas toward the south became part of Serbian Vojvodina. This was an area where historically Serbs had not lived, but because of the movements of the Great Migrations, Serbians now lived in those regions, and that region was given a certain degree of autonomy within the larger Austrian Empire. That said, because of the 1848 revolution, a lot of the Croatian nationalist aspirations were forced to go underground. Croatian publishing, Croatian public presence was deemed illegal, just like all other non-German language notifications were in the larger Austrian Empire. However, because of increasing Serbian independence from the Ottoman Empire, you begin to see an independent Serbia develop. And in this period of independent Serbia, you have the creation of modern Serbianism and Greater Serbia. What does that mean? So one of the ministers of Serbia, I believe he was the Minister of Defense, but I might be wrong on that, was Ilija Garashinin. And Garashinin was particularly enamored with the idea of Greater Serbia. Now, you can see sort of a map. This is by Miloš Milojević, but it's the same idea, more or less, that all of the South Slavs, indicated in blue, should be part of a Greater Serbia. When we talk about Greater Serbia, we're sort of seeing two things going on at the same time. Serbs believe that if Serbia is just a small state, that it will be vulnerable to those larger empires, the Austrians to the north, the Ottomans to the south. And they also believe that other southern Slavs can be part of the Serbian national project. They don't have to belong to the Serbian Orthodox Church in order to do so. And they don't necessarily have to speak exactly the same language as Serbians do. This creates a very new orientation. Now, these beliefs are published in what's called the Nacertinje. The Nacertinje was published in 1848, but it remained a secretive document for over 40 years. So it didn't influence public policy, but it did influence private policy at the higher levels of the Serbian government and begin to orient Serbia towards a greater Serbian identity. There are several elements that we can see that show that this greater Serbian identity was coming to the fore. The first was that Vuk Cvijović, who we've seen before, right? He was the one that went out and canvassed Serbia for opinions of the local people. He studied what was called the Shtokavian dialect, which and they're calling it the Shtokavian dialect of the larger Yugoslavic languages. Because the South Slavs, those of former Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, spoke languages that were related to one another. So the question was sort of mapping out what do those languages look like? What kind of dialects are there? And coming to a consensus. And you can see that included in the Shtokavian dialect are areas of Croatia and Bosnia, which are not organized within the Serbian Orthodox Church, showing that there was a recognition that this language was spoken by more than just Serbian people who were Serbian religiously, and perhaps the Serbian nationalism could encompass them too. In Ungarhase in Peć, Kosovo, there was a meeting called the Vienna Congress, and it actually took place in the building you can see there. And Vuk Cvijović was there. So were a number of Croats, and they came to the consensus of what the Yugoslav language would be. They recognized that the Shtokavian dialect, they all recognized the Shtokavian dialect existed. They recognized that there were both Cyrillic alphabets, the alphabet championed by the Serbs, and Latin alphabets championed by the Croats that represented this language. They did not recognize the Arabic alphabet of the Bosniaks, because the Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks were not represented at this conference, but the Latin alphabet of the Croats and the Cyrillic alphabet of the Serbs were represented as co-equal alphabets, both part of the greater South Slavic identity. And in this way, you begin to see the formulation of perhaps a relationship between Croats and Serbs in a future nation, despite the fact that Croats, of course, are in the Austrian Empire, and the Serbs are either independent or are in the Ottoman Empire. Now, another thing that starts to develop within the Austrian context is what's called Croatian Slavonia. In 1867, when the Hungarians get more rights within the Austrian Empire and it becomes the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Croatia falls under the Hungarians and is subject again to those policies of majorization, of Hungarification. And so they protest until they're given semi-autonomy in what is called Croatian Slavonia. Now, Croatian Slavonia controls, let's say, the northern part of Croatia. You can see it on the map. Of all the parts of Croatia, north and east of those orange lines that are drawn on the map. This was the first time that, at least on paper, Croatia was recognized as an independent entity. That said, the power of Croatian Slavonia was significantly curtailed, and in practice, the Hungarian government, which controlled the eastern half of the empire, the lands of St. Stephen, if we want to be very specific, the Hungarians controlled the policy of Croatian Slavonia far more than the Croats did. One of the other compromises that came out of the Ungarhase meeting in Peć was that the Yugoslavia dialect, which is represented on this map as sort of a muddy brown color, the Yugoslavia dialect would be the formalized form of Serbo-Croatian as a larger language. And what does that mean? When you have multiple dialects of a language, you can choose which way you want the language represented, right? You could do what the Indonesians did, which is that they had a number of different languages. They had Sumatran, they had Javanese, they had Bornean, it's called Kalimantan. You had Malay. You had a number of these related languages. They're mostly mutually intelligible, not entirely so. But you can think of it like Spanish and Portuguese, like very close languages. And so the question becomes, right, you have an island, you have a nation with these speakers of multiple different languages. What do you do? Option A is typically to do what the African countries have done, which is just use the language of the colonizer. That way, everybody was already forced to understand it. You're home scot-free. Well, in the case of Yugoslavia, number one, there were two different colonizers, so that doesn't really help matters. And B, the languages were close enough together that it doesn't make sense to avoid that altogether. You could choose option number 2, which is what the Indonesians did, which is that they created a new language called Bahasa, which was a simplified form of Javanese, integrating words and vocabulary from some of the other languages. And because it was standardized and simplified, it's actually very easy to learn Bahasa. And it's one of the few invented languages that has become a national language of any country. So that's also a possibility. But at Ungar Hase, they rejected both of these possibilities and instead chose that they would do what the Italians had done. The Italians chose the Florentine dialect based on Dante's Divine Comedy to be the official language of Italy. So instead of trying to create a unified Italian new dialect that would be similar to Bahasa in Indonesia, they used the Florentine dialect that already existed and just told people to learn that dialect. In the case of the Serbians, the Yugoslavia dialect, and the Croatians agreed with this, should be the basis of the Serbo-Croatian language. So they didn't invent a new language within the same sort of bandwidth. They used one that already existed. And after this point, we begin seeing a unitary formation between the Cyrillic letters and the Latin letters with a one-to-one correspondence. There's one exception, which is LJ in the Latin letters becomes one letter in Cyrillic. But otherwise, there's a one-to-one correspondence, and we begin to see, with the exception of certain verbs or certain nouns that are unique to the different dialects, consistent spelling between the different dialects, because they begin to start writing in this Yugoslavia accent. As we move towards 1878, we begin to have more and more rebellions within the Ottoman Empire by Slavic populations. The Montenegrins under Prince Nicola I, Petrović Njegoš, manages to break free of the Ottomans, but the Serbs who were living in Bosnia and Herzegovina were much less successful in 1875. Their rebellion was put down, as was the Bulgarian Rebellion, which led to the Batak Massacre. And the massacres, like the Batak Massacre, perpetrated by the Ottomans against the Bulgarian nationalists, and the massacres that went against the Serbians in Bosnia, captured the attention of Russia, resulting in Russia declaring war in 1877. And the Russian attack on the Ottoman Empire was extremely decisive. I spent a lot of time in, I think it's episode 31 of my Middle Eastern history series, going through the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, so I'm not going to go through it here, mostly because this war itself has very little bearing. The tactics of this war have very little bearing on what happens in Yugoslavia, but it effectively pushes the Ottoman Empire for the most part, into a much weaker position in Europe following the Congress of Vienna, which establishes clear recognition for Montenegro, on this map identified in purple, Serbia on this map identified in green, and Bulgaria on this map identified in dark orange. This treaty is negotiated by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, and results in a powerful Balkans region that can challenge the Ottoman Empire. So all of these different states tried to have an alliance, and there were reasons why it really didn't work. The first one is that the various Christian countries all wanted Macedonia. The Serbs agreed that the people in Macedonia didn't speak the Shtokavian dialect. They spoke something else. They said that it was different from Bulgarian. It was somewhere on the continuum, and it could be Serbicized to a certain extent that there will be a Macedonian identity within the larger Yugoslav, the larger Southern Slavic identity. This was part of the greater Serbia view. The Bulgarians argued that the Macedonians spoke Bulgarian, and the Greeks argued that there was a significant Greek population in the southern part of Macedonia. And so those areas should all those nations believe that that territory should belong to them, resulting in various conflicts and conflagrations. And also Serbia, while Serbia maintained a very pro-Russian stance because of how much Russia had helped them in that most recent war in 1877, Bulgaria was increasingly distancing itself from Russia. And so Serbia and Bulgaria became more and more at odds. And in fact, this sort of examines much more closely the region of Macedonia, indicated by blue on the left-hand side, being divided between ethnic Greeks in orange. If we look at the central map, ethnic Greeks in orange, ethnic Serbs in blue, ethnic Bulgarians in light green, and then Macedonians, who Serbs considered to be Serbian or Serbifiable, and that Bulgarians consider Bulgarian. Now, the red dots that are scattered throughout are Muslims, ethnic Turks. So you end up having fights between the various nations and their emissaries, meaning militia groups, throughout Macedonia, angling to control the region. Now, of course, from the Bulgarian perspective, Macedonia was Bulgarian. You can see this is a map produced by the Bulgarian Linguistic University. So that should show you the bias there. But if you look, you can see all of the different dialects of Bulgarian that are identified by how they use the words zab and mij. And the colors are unitary based on how they pronounce those words. And you can see that Macedonia fits in with the linguistic continuum that exists in Bulgaria. And a number of the people in Macedonia were believers in the Bulgarian Exarchate, which was the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, for want of a better term. And so Bulgarians saw the people of that region as being part of Bulgaria. The Serbs, however, saw it as Serbian, and the Macedonians saw it as Macedonian. So the Serbians developed what was called the Society of Saint Sava and armed what were called chetas, or guerrilla bands, to fight in the region in order to bring it under Serbian control. In many cases, a lot of Macedonian leaders who would eventually fight Serbs were raised by the Society of Saint Sava and educated by Serbians. And the education was a way for Serbians to implant a cultural distinction in the region. Now, following Yugoslavia, most Macedonians don't consider themselves Serbian, but they also don't consider themselves Bulgarian. And that is a direct result, as we'll see throughout this series, of the creation of Macedonian historiography. There were a number of revolts throughout Macedonia, which was still under Ottoman control, at least nominally. Right, you had the Inspector General Hüseyin Hilmi Pasha, who was the Ottoman governor of the region. And you had Komitaji, who were Bulgarian, ethnic Macedonian or ethno-Bulgarian forces, who operated very similar to the Chetas, these sort of roving bands. And in Kruševo, for a few months in 1903, they established a Macedonian Republic, and for about 2 weeks or so in elsewhere in Bulgaria, also in 1903, there was the Stranja commune. Both of these were undone by the Turkish authorities. As a reaction to the Serbian, Bulgarian, and Greek nationalism of the period, you also had Albanian nationalism. And as you can see, Albanian nationalism looks to take under its wing territories that are part of what the Serbs believe to be theirs, areas where there are speakers of the Shtokavian dialect, like Novi Pazar and Kosovo in the north, and also much of North Macedonia, which the Serbs have an eye on in terms of expanding and creating Greater Serbia. So as we go through this, we'll see a conflict that continues and develops between Albanians and Albanian speakers and those Serbians and other South Slavic speakers. And the last thing I wanted to cover today, before leaving this in Vuk's hands for next time, was the change of power in Serbia just about 10 years prior to World War I. As you can see, the Obrenovićes are in power. The Obrenovićes being that more conciliatory, Austrian-leaning dynasty of Serbian rulers. They're assassinated by agents of Dragutin Dmitrijević, known as Apis. And instead, the more militant Petar I Karađorđević is given power. And this ultimately will allow Serbia to become much more expansionist, much more militaristic in terms of achieving its aims. So, questions, comments, concerns?
Do you want me to unmute everybody? Maybe people want to talk.
Yeah, if anybody wants to speak up, please raise your hand, and I'll recognize you. Hi, Patty.
Hi. Not that this matters at all, but at a couple of points during the latter part of this discussion, I got this image of like sort of Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Connecticut and Rhode Island all trying to decide what part of New England would belong to whom. Is that like a completely far-fetched understanding of what you're talking about?
No, I actually think that the Macedonian question is very similar to where should we draw the state line boundaries. I would say, though, that there's one very strong functional distinction, which is that it's very easy for somebody to change from being a Rhode Islander to being a New Hampshirean. I don't know how you would phrase it, or Massachusettsian or whatever, because there's no, I mean, maybe this is my lack of knowledge, but I don't think that there's any truly distinguishing quality between any of the different New England states.
Have you ever heard of Republicans and Democrats?
Sure, I would say that those are much more meaningful distinctions, right?
Yeah, well, we have free staters here in New Hampshire, so yeah, there are some extremes. Yeah,
there are, but the point that I'm making is that it's not like people in Massachusetts speak a different language, or that people from Massachusetts, I don't know, are mostly from North Africa, and people from New Hampshire are mostly from Norway, right? Like it's not, the differences are not so vast that a person can't see themselves as having these different identities.
right.
I think if you're looking at in Macedonia, you have people who speak Greek as their mother tongue. You have people who speak Macedonian as their mother tongue, and by Macedonian I mean however you see that language, as whether it's unique or on the Bulgarian continuum. You have people who speak Serbian as their mother tongue. You have people who speak Albanian as their mother tongue. You have people who speak Turkish as their mother tongue. You have people who pray in different houses of worship. You have very different community senses within like just towns of each other, right? So it ends up being this thing that looks like a vegetarian pizza, right? You have all these different groups mixed in together, but very distinctive, each element on its own. And so the national groups from the outside are looking in saying, we're going to take as much of this pie as we can, and sort of ignoring the fact that that it's not only broccoli in this section of pizza.
Yeah. Oh, well, part of the reason I think that is because if you live in this part of the country, ocean rights, seacoast, all that sort of thing is huge. I mean, just here where I live, where the boundary line between Maine and New Hampshire within the dividing river was huge for many years, and it matters a lot. But also too, I realize you have the overriding influence always of the federal government here. But I'm really thinking, and again, probably if you didn't live in New England, you might not know some of those regional economic issues, which probably are not, well, I would say they probably rival the intensity of language and communication issues, because if your whole economy is based on this thing or that thing, it matters hugely.
No, it's worth considering. I just sort of struggle with, I guess, in my own mind, the differences. All right,
Because we're all little states too. That's part of why I got that imagery.
Yeah, no, it's the right image. It's the right image of fighting over territory that everybody thinks that they should have a right to. And one of the things that I talked about, I have a presentation on the Macedonian question itself, is a lot of Macedonians say, well, why didn't you ever ask us? Like, you kept taking our territory. Like, why didn't you ever run a plebiscite in Macedonia? See how we feel. Should we be a part of Bulgaria? Should we be part of Serbia? Should we be independent? Should we be part of Greece? Should we be part of Albania? No. Maybe we should divide. Like you imposed a solution on us. We never got to say what we really feel. And even today, a lot of Macedonians are really angry with the North Macedonian government because they don't see it as representative of their interest, despite the fact that it is, in theory, democratically elected. There's a lot of corruption in Macedonia. All right, Lon?
I was going to say today, Yugoslavia is broken up into several different countries. Do they have different languages? That was the reason for their split up, or was it because of ethnics?
Sure. Let me pull up a map of modern Yugoslavia so we can know what we're talking about while I speak about it. Actually, you know what? I like this map better. Okay, so a bit of Slovenia is cut off on the map on the left. I'm using the map from 1992. The map, a little bit of Slovenia cut off. That's the blue one. But Slovenian is definitely a distinct language. The language of North Macedonia is definitely a distinct language from Serbian. There's a question as to whether it's distinct from Bulgarian, but it's certainly distinct from Serbian. You can see in the southern part of Serbia is Albanian, which is the region of Kosovo, right? But the languages that are indicated on this map as dark blue, that's Montenegrin. Maybe if I have a pointer, it'll be a little bit clearer. So let me get out a pointer. So here's North Macedonia. You can see the North Macedonian color. Here's Slovenia. So North Macedonian and Slovenian are clearly not the same as the Shtokavian dialect, which is the most traditional version of it is here. But that's clear that these are clearly not the same language. They are Southern Slavic languages, certainly, but they have different grammatical constructs. Think Portuguese is clearly not Spanish. It's close, but it's clearly distinct enough to be separate. Now, the language here in sort of dark green and light green is Croatian. The language in this sort of yellowish green is Serbian. This is also Serbian here. The language in brown is Bosniak, which is the language of the Muslims of the region speak. This dark blue is Montenegrin.
I'll do the pillowcases. So
the blue here is Montenegrin. And all of those languages, Croatian, Bosniak, Serbian, Montenegrin, all of these are all Shtokavian dialect. Now, they are mutually intelligible with one another, but they are quite distinct. I'm trying to think of a good example. Think about if you took somebody from the English countryside and you took somebody from the American South. Yes, they're both speaking English, and yes, they would understand each other, but they would sound quite different, right? You'd have some person, like the English person would say, you know, I was moving about in the garden and I saw somebody going into their flat, right? And you'd have the same person from the American South saying, I was moving about the yard and I, you know, my Southern accent is obviously not that great, but like, you know, I was moving about in the yard and I saw somebody just go into their apartment over yonder, right? So they're mutually intelligible, but they won't be sounding the same. And so speakers of the Shtokavian dialect who speak it as native speakers, this term is also used Serbo-Croatian, although I feel like it's less inclusive because it doesn't include Bosniak or Montenegrin in that definition, but they can tell from somebody's choice of words which area they come from, because it has that sort of British countryside to American South level of distinctiveness, despite being mutually intelligible. So those are, you could say the same language, or you could say a different language, depending on your political aspiration, right? How much do you want to divide these people, or how much do you want to push them together? Albanian is a completely different language family altogether. So Albanian would never be confused for any of these Yugoslav languages, including Macedonian. Beverly, did you want to add something or ask something?
My question's actually about Albania. In that, where I live, many of the restaurants, Italian restaurants, the chefs are from Albania. The connection between Albania and the food is wonderful. Highly trained chefs, the connection between, and I know it's totally off topic, Albania and Italy.
Actually, look, Albania is extremely close to Italy.
Yes.
So Albanian food is not Italian food, by the way. Albanian food is much more similar to what you would find in Greece, for example, or what you would find in Serbia. But Albanians, because of the proximity to Italy, have had a long history of business relationships with Italy, especially during the post-World War II period, when the Albanian economy was dominated by the fact that it was ruled by Enver Hoxha, who was a communist who was so profoundly communist that he, during the Sino-Soviet split, sided with China, citing Russia as not being communist enough. That should give you an idea of how repressive and how organized the country was. Additionally, Albania is very religiously mixed. They all speak the same language, but they're religiously mixed. So you've got Catholic.
Yes.
So you have a large Catholic population, and that Catholic population was thoroughly repressed within Albania under the Hoxha period. They found religious refuge in Italy as well as working possibilities. So that's where that connection really comes from in the post-war period.
Also, in the 20s and 30s, Italy had a virtual protectorate over Albania.
That's true.
It had a nominal king, Zog, I believe, but they really were calling the shots at that time. So,
yeah, that's absolutely correct. So, starting from 1913, there was an international coalition that defended the city of Shkodër, which is in northern Albania. They were defending it from the Montenegrin army, and that led to King Zog requesting a continual Italian presence. And in 1938, that became expanded as Italy was moving towards World War II. And it became part of the Italian Empire in World War II. After World War II, however, the communist revolution that took over Yugoslavia also had an impact in Albania, which is why they had the Hoxha regime that I was mentioning earlier. And liberalization in Albania also meant that a lot of people were leaving because the economy was it didn't recover very quickly. Albania is still the poorest country in Europe.
I'm also going to include a book that I read many, many years ago. And I believe that Nicholas Gage is the author. And he writes the story. He's originally born in Albania. The story of his mother, Eleni, and it's quite beautiful, historical, and I highly recommend it. So I'm gonna just post that.
Any other questions, comments?
Yes, I wrote my question about Thrace. How many Bulgarian really were there at least when they turned Greece after the Second Balkan War or whatever? How
Sure.
legitimate is the claim of Bulgarian for Thrace and of Greece?
Okay. Well, I didn't discuss Thrace today. I discussed Macedonia. So I just want to be clear the terminology that we're using. If we're looking at Thrace, because the question you asked is about Thrace, here's a really great map. So I'm going to use this map. This is the region of Macedonia. This is the region of Thrace here.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about Thrace, the Thracian population was very, very mixed. I don't believe that there was a majority of Turks, Bulgarians, or Greeks in the territory of Thrace. We certainly know that with the Treaty of Neuilly-sur-Seine, which was the treaty that gave the territory from Bulgaria to Greece at the end of World War I, right? Because the borders that you see here in this map are the borders that existed at the end of the Balkan Wars. So when that treaty happened, 62,000 Bulgarians were deported from the region, and roughly 42,000 Greeks were deported from the rest of Bulgaria to the region. So it's quite clear that there was a large Bulgarian population there. We also know that there was a large Turkish population there because during the Balkan Wars, we had large numbers of Muhajir who came from Thrace to Istanbul and other parts of Anatolia. Again, it's very hard to get an exact reading on the demography of the area. And there are jokes during the Versailles Treaty Convention, right? Because the war ended in 1918, World War I ended in 1918. Versailles only came out as a treaty midway through 1919. It took them an entire year to hear from all the different groups. And by the time the Hungarians were presenting their maps of the various groups in Hungary, like literally you had European representatives rolling their eyes and saying, not another ethnic map, because every group had painted the statistics in a way that would be more advantageous to its group. Were there Greeks in Thrace? Certainly. They were certainly a large population, at least 25 to 30%. Were they the majority? Probably not. But neither were the Turks and neither were the Bulgarians. It was a very mixed territory.
Thank you.
These are our links. Please join our meetup to find out about more events. We have lots of different kinds of events. I'll go through that in a second. You can also subscribe to our YouTube page. As I said, this presentation and all of our past presentations and hopefully all of our future presentations will be recorded on that YouTube channel. Also, as I said, PayPal donations are always appreciated. That link as well, because it costs money to have YouTube membership. It costs money to have a Zoom membership, and it costs money to maintain a meetup membership. So those costs get borne by us in order to provide you this kind of content. All right. And in terms of the content that we do provide, this is our history, mostly ancient discussions. And you can sort of think of our group as like CNN with all of its different shows run by different people with sort of their different agendas and directions. So I give a series on Middle Eastern Islamic history. That's every Thursday at 7 p.m. Our upcoming episode this week is on the Caucasian Wars, which was from 1917 to 1921. That's Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, in the part where Turkey, Iran, and Russia meet. It was a huge place of violence at the end of World War I, and so we're going to go over that. And we're going to spend a lot of time in the 1920s throughout the Middle East, understanding the mandate system, understanding modern Iran, understanding the Turkish Republic over the next month and a half. We have Greco-Roman civilization. That's nearly every Saturday. And that's run by Zach, Greg, and Paul. Now, all of us are not accredited individuals, but we all have knowledge to the degree, hopefully, that I do. And so the presentations will be as detailed and as authoritative. Jason leads two different groups, one on Asian philosophy, one on Greco-Roman philosophy. The Asian philosophy is on Saturdays at 7. The Greco-Roman philosophy is at Mondays at 7. Aaron and I meet to discuss European Union security. In fact, tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern time, we're meeting together and we're going to discuss the period of the aughts. That's 2001 until about 2008 in European Union security, and that's going to be tomorrow at 2. We meet about once a month to discuss that. Jane has a series on powerful women. We've talked about Queen Tsarina Katerina of Russia, Catherine the Great of Russia, and she presents these powerful women throughout history. Fantastic series. We also have Sergio Martinez, who periodically will give discussions on arms and armor. We have a new series developing on dead languages. Of course, you're here in the Yugoslavian history and culture and economy, and unfortunately, Vuk Cvijović couldn't be here. But as I said, this series will be probably about monthly on Saturdays. We're thinking probably towards the end of September is when he'd give his second episode. And then, of course, we have our short run series. We have an upcoming discussion on the Russo-Ukrainian War, probably in early October, to discuss the most recent developments in the Russo-Ukrainian War. We also have that Islam 101 series that we're conducting with Dr. Sabil Ahmed on the weekend of the 4th of September. I'm doing a question and answer with him to sort of ask him more in-depth questions about Islam and sort of get something a little bit more than the 101. And then finally, I had a crusade series. That series is done, and you can look at it on the YouTube channel. It's 5 episodes where we go through all of the different kinds of crusades that affected the Middle East. All right, so thank you so much for coming.